Hey, what up guys? Welcome back to Darth Matu's Holocron. I know, I haven't done one of these in quite some time, but I'm happy to be speaking to all of you out of character for once. I hope you all like the new format for the lore videos. I certainly enjoy recording them far more. Feels less like work, more like disappearing into these worlds for a while. Anyway, for those of you who are new to the channel and maybe haven't seen a Darth Matu Speaks before, the Holocron is not just about exploring lore. It's also about celebrating and exploring narrative storytelling in general. I'm a writer myself. I have a new IP which should be at 2025 Gen Con that I can't wait to talk about in the near future, and the craft of writing itself has always been important to me. We've talked about the 5-man band, the monomyth, and a few more things here at the Holocron. Today, we're going to go over a more recent discussion over narrative, a book that was released in 2004 by the title of The 7 Basic Plots. The 7 Basic Plots was written by Christopher Booker, and it is an attempt to analyze patterns in narrative storytelling from around the world in a Jungian fashion. Jungian. Say that 10 times fast. Anyway, he does this in order to find commonalities that can be used to group narratives into similar groups regardless of culture or context. Immediately off the bat, I really have to push heavily back against the work. I do not like the more modern tendency to reduce things to a handful of common groups, and I especially don't like it in regards to writing. Concepts like the monomyth or the 5-man band are helpful not because they tell you what kind of story you will be writing, but because they give you a framework that you can use to craft any kind of story. They're not limited to a specific narrative or approach, and indeed, I would argue that the point of writing is to try to find your own narrative voice and approach. I do not believe that there are only 7 basic plots. I have to push back on that. The narrative theory, known as the Dramatica, pioneered by Chris Huntley and Melanie Phillips, a competing narrative theory that's been developed into a software suite that you can actually use to help yourself write, seems to suggest that there are 32,000 individual plots, and some people have even argued that it goes as high as 128,000. Indeed, even within the 7 basic plots itself, there are not 7 plot structures. It introduced us to 9 basic plots, which I found a bit surprising given the title. The attempt to reduce narrative is ultimately futile, and I honestly think that this is a good thing. It means that you as a writer can create an original plot. You can tell an original and groundbreaking narrative. You should not despair in that regard. But with all that said, storytelling is a part of the human experience, which means that if you are human, the way you tell stories will share similarities to the way that others also tell stories. Not only that, but exploring some of these plot structures can help to provide a basic framework for inspiration. If you know adventure stories, then you're more likely to be able to craft one, right? Same idea here. Despite the fact that there are more plots than we could possibly ever go over in a video, and despite the fluid and evolving nature of narrative storytelling over human history, I thought we would go over the 9 plots that the 7 basic plots talk about. While there are almost certainly a nigh on infinite number of plots, I still think that understanding these 9 can be helpful to you. You can use this discussion to hopefully fuel your own writing and hone your own understanding of narrative. Alright, so let's dive into it. Before we get into the plots themselves, Booker asserts that the plots all progress through the same 5 stages. This simplified narrative progression is not something that I necessarily agree with, but it's certainly useful for helping to contextualize ideas about narrative progression to begin with. According to Booker, any plot progresses from the anticipation, to the dream, to the frustration, to the nightmare, to either the miraculous escape or the hero's destruction in the case of tragedies. The anticipation is when the setting and the hero are introduced. The hero is usually constrained or unfulfilled at this point. The dream is when the hero embarks on the journey of the story and meets with initial success. The frustration is when the hero's limitations and the strength of the opposing forces becomes more obvious. The nightmare is when some final ordeal takes place that sets the stage for a final resolution, and then the miraculous escape or the hero's destruction is when the final resolution to the narrative finally comes. I personally believe that this paradigm lacks some levels of nuance and universal application. It fails to really address some aspects of narrative storytelling the same way another universal framework like the monomyth has, but nonetheless, the structure more or less does conform to the general flow of the monomyth. You can see echoes of the descent to the underworld within the nightmare, for example. Now that we understand Booker's basic logic on how stories unfold, let's dive into the plots themselves. The first one that Booker talks about is called Overcoming the Monster. Some examples of overcoming the monster plots include Dracula, Frankenstein, War of the Worlds, but also things like James Bond or the Magnificent Seven. The, quote, monster that the hero overcomes doesn't actually have to be a monster. Rather, it can be some kind of antagonistic force that comes in from without in order to attack or disrupt the hero's home. James Bond defends England and the world from dastardly villains. The Magnificent Seven come together to defend a town from rampaging bands of outlaws. Overcoming the monster, like all the plots, follows the same progression that we just discussed. For Booker, this plot begins in the anticipation when the monster is first revealed. The reader comes to understand that the monster is a threat to the hero's way of life. The hero is then called to fight the monster, and the dream is their preparations to face down against the threat. In a James Bond movie, the dream would be the scene where he meets with Q and first gets all his fancy gadgets. In the frustration, the hero first confronts the monster, but they cannot overcome it. In classic Bond movies, this usually involved James getting himself captured by the villain somehow. In the nightmare, the hero confronts the monster without hope of victory. For James Bond, this usually involves setting off bombs to blow up the entire building and then blasting everything that moves. In GoldenEye, they even make this tendency a plot point by causing it to be the inciting action that creates the movie's monster in the first place when James betrays 006. In The Miraculous Escape, the hero finally manages to defeat the monster. In James Bond's case, he often literally achieves a miraculous escape. It is a point of Booker that the hero often gets the girl and or receives some treasure at this phase, but it's worth pointing out that this assertion is pretty baseless. There's a whole lot of stories that end without this happening. Alien jumps to mind. How did Ripley get the girl or receive any treasure? Anyway, it doesn't matter. In general, these are good ideas to help you form your own plots. Just keep in mind as a caveat that no one, not me, not Booker, not Campbell, no one really has a foolproof method. We're all just doing our best, and these ideas are their interpretation. Use them or discard them at your leisure. The ability to do so is what makes the truly great writers stand out. The next plot is called The Rags to Riches. Rags to Riches is a bit of a misleading name because monetary wealth is not necessary for this plot. It involves a central hero who is poor, unnoticed, or unappreciated. They undertake a journey of growth that ends in them earning success, recognition, or wealth. Doesn't have to be wealth. This is a classic plot structure that includes stories such as Prince and the Pauper, Le Morte d'Arthur, otherwise known as King Arthur in the Story of Camelot, Aladdin, and several other very famous narratives. It's also a common plot structure in modern storytelling. I don't know if you guys were around for all of the sports movies that came out in the late 90s and early 2000s, but movies like Mike, The Rookie, and all of those other ones also apply when it comes to rags to riches. You could also apply it to characters like Spider-Man. Spider-Man goes from rags to riches, in that he goes from a nerdy nobody to freaking Spider-Man. In the anticipation of a rags to riches story, the hero is miserable, humble, and unhappy. They are unappreciated and unnoticed, even outright persecuted. In the dream, the hero is called out into the wider world, and there they find initial success that gets them noticed. Booker makes a point of noting that they likely meet a love interest who was previously above them. In the frustration, the hero's new status quo begins to unravel even if they themselves do not notice it. This can often take the form of ignoring or mistreating old friends, or just outright eschewing old behavior. In the nightmare, everything goes wrong for the hero. They lose their new status and with it access to the love that they had gained. In the miraculous escape, the hero manages to regain their true love and they obtain a new, even higher level of status. In more modern storytelling, this often takes the form of the hero noticing a true love that had previously gone unnoticed, but had always been there for the hero, even at their low status at the start of the narrative. The so-called status that the hero gains often takes the form of finding a new level of appreciation for their lot in life, becoming queen or king of their own existence. Booker provides two variations to this plot that count as it ending in the hero's destruction. The first variation has the hero flat out fail to win, and usually it's because they sought new status for selfish reasons. The second variation, Booker calls the hollow victory. This is where the hero does obtain the new status they seek, but in so doing they lose everything they once had, maybe even end up constantly frustrated. A good example of the hollow victory would be the arc of Michael Corleone in The Godfather, ascending to become the head of a crime family when he never even wanted in the business in the first place. The third plot is called The Quest, and you guys probably already understood this one as soon as I said the name, but we're still gonna go over it. In a crude sense, this plot could be called an encapsulation of the basic foundation of the monomyth. Stories built on The Quest include Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, The Odyssey, and more. Booker differs from the monomyth in several key points, however. For one, according to Booker, in the anticipation, the hero exists in a city of destruction. By this he means life is intolerable, even oppressive to the hero. But this is patently not something universal. I mean, Frodo and Bilbo are both pretty comfortable and happy in The Lord of the Rings. I think it's fairly clear that Booker misses the mark on this one. So, to expand upon his point, during the anticipation exists the status quo. Life is humdrum, it's full of routine, but this is not always a bad thing. Sometimes, the hero even likes the status quo. Regardless, the important thing is that the hero is in a kind of stasis, trapped by normal life. During the dream, the hero receives the call to adventure. Their status quo is disrupted somehow, and they end up on a journey with a singular goal or aim. In the case of Lord of the Rings, that aim is the destruction of the ring. In the case of Star Wars, it's the defeat of the Empire. During the frustration, the hero learns that the quest will not be easy. They come face to face with the reality of the world outside their status quo. In the nightmare, the hero endures their descent to the underworld. They suffer a defeat and have to regroup and recover. This would be The Empire Strikes Back for Star Wars. In the miraculous escape, the hero uses their recovery from the nightmare to defeat the villain and achieve the quest, whatever it may be. The hero gains the kingdom, treasure, princess, etc., and they can return home to their status quo changed. The variation on this ending is the hero's fall. This is when the hero, even if they defeat the villain, they fail to truly actualize the goal of the quest. The fall of Isildur would be a great example of this in action. In this variation, the hero's fall makes the world worse. They're usually not in a way that is immediately obvious to the inhabitants of that world. The fourth plot is known as The Voyage and the Return. This plot structure revolves around a hero that is called away to a new and strange world. The Time Machine by H.G. Wells, I swear I know how to talk, is a good example of this plot in action. In the anticipation, we meet the hero and see the world and life they call their own. In the dream, the hero is called away. They slip into a new reality, are abducted by aliens, lost in time, etc. They discover a new world, and at first, its novelty is attractive to the hero. In the frustration, the hero begins to find themselves limited in the new world. They cannot act fully in accordance with their own wishes, and this begins to color their interaction with their new reality. In the nightmare, the hero attempts to return home, but finds they cannot for whatever reason. The thrilling new world that the hero has found themselves in has now become an active threat to the hero. This plot structure differs slightly from the others in that Booker says that there will always be a thrilling escape from the other world. He says that the hero always returns home, but the difference between a miraculous escape and a hero's fall is a matter of growth. If the heroes grow, then they return home better than before, and their escape facilitates their satisfaction as a character. If they have not grown, then the hero must leave something behind in the other world. A valued treasure, their lost love. The hero does return home, but at a cost that is very dear to them. I feel like it's worth pointing out that the variability of this plot structure by itself calls into question how reductionist Booker tends to be. I mean, just right here, we see that his 5-stage structure is not immutable even within his own framework. Once again, I must emphasize that while this conversation is good to help ponder plot, it is not the word of God. Use it to fuel yourself, but don't take it as law. Booker's framework falls apart completely over the next plot, which is the comedy. Traditionally, a comedy has been defined as a story that is humorous, satirical, but also any story which has a happy ending. If it has a happy ending, it's a comedy. Booker tries to narrow things down in regards to comedy's definition, but he finds that his 5-stage structure cannot be applied to comedy at all. He doesn't even try, which just, again, goes to show that this stuff is not writing law. Instead, he says that all comedies very loosely follow 3 stages. In the first stage of a comedy, a web of relationship lives under the oppressive shadow of something. It could even be the hero themselves, who's acting selfishly. In stage 2, the confusion worsens until a resolution by the community is required. In stage 3, the truth comes out, relationships are healed, and everyone is happy. I think you can see how useless this is. Honestly, it's like Booker flat out just does not understand comedy, so he didn't even try. The plot structure by itself once again goes to show that, like I said, this is not law. We are all just doing our best. And where Campbell was a professor and a researcher, Booker's a journalist. It's very clear that he has a general understanding of comedy when he wrote this, and that he doesn't fully grasp what he's trying to describe. I can't claim to understand it much better. I mean, I don't even have a college degree, so what the fuck do I know, right? But I'll do a video on comedy and tragedy in the future. What Booker does go out on a limb to say about comedy is defined by the ending. It's how the characters come to terms. He says the same thing about tragedies, which is the next plot structure. When a comedy ends, the characters are happy. A tragedy is the reverse, but a tragedy does not necessarily have to end in tears and woe. The truth is that a tragedy revolves around the hero's sense of satisfaction. If a comedy is a happy ending and not just a laughing one, then a tragedy is a story where the hero has not grown or changed by the end, and not necessarily a story with sadness. The anticipation of a tragedy starts with the hero feeling unfulfilled somehow. Maybe they are overtly unhappy, or maybe they just yearn for something more. In the dream, the hero finds themselves drawn by some concept or course of action, usually something tied to temptation or something forbidden. In the case of Romeo and Juliet, this would be Romeo's sudden love for Juliet. In the frustration, things begin to go badly for the hero, and they resort to unwise or unrash actions as a result. In Romeo and Juliet, this would include things like their hasty marriage, the duel that lands Romeo in hot water, even their sudden suicides when stricken with grief. This later situation would be the nightmare. In a tragedy, the nightmare is when the hero loses control. Things spiral far beyond them. In Romeo and Juliet, this would be when Romeo is banished and when the doomed pair is convinced that the other one has died. Finally, the end of a tragedy is always a hero's fall, so to speak. The hero may survive, they may even maintain their old status in life, but they have not grown. They return to their state of unhappiness and dissatisfaction at the end of a tragedy, and this return to their initial state is what marks it as a tragedy in the first place. The seventh plot structure is known as the rebirth, and here Booker is yet again a bit vague. The rebirth revolves around the hero or heroine who is trapped, oppressed, or dead. The hero is only freed and pushed to grow by another character's loving act. The Beauty and the Beast is a good example of this plot, but in a more modern sense, so is Avatar: The Last Airbender. In the rebirth, the anticipation takes place with the hero or heroine under the shadow of a dark power. In Avatar, this occurs when Aang goes into hibernation at the start of the story, frozen in ice for 100 years. When he awakens, the very status quo of the world, a world where the nations are out of balance, is the oppressive force that he has to work against. In the dream, the hero meets with initial success and the oppressive force seems like it has to fall back. In the frustration, the evil returns in full force and imprisons the hero in a state of living death. In Avatar, this would be when Aang first confronts Azula and is nearly mortally wounded by her lightning. In the nightmare, the dark power seems to have completely triumphed. This would be the period in Avatar after the fall of Ba Sing Se, when Aang and Team Avatar are in hiding as they prepare to face the Fire Lord. In the miraculous escape, someone saves the hero from this oppression, which allows the hero to save the day. In the case of Avatar, this would be Aang, realizing that the love he has for his friends ultimately gives him the ability to change the status quo in the world without resorting to violence. It's worth noting at this point, once again, Booker's work is called The Seven Plots, and yet here we are, at 7 covered, and we still have 2 more to go. Like I said at the beginning, Booker is hardly consistent even with his own logic. These ideas, this discussion can be useful, but my God, he's not even consistent in his own framework. Reading the book was maddening. I felt like I was being gaslighted into believing like the title was something else. Anyway, Booker dislikes but concedes that there are 2 additional plots, the mystery and the rebellion against the One. His disdain for these plots is evident, and he puts almost no effort into exploring them. But that doesn't mean that we're not gonna. Booker doesn't even try to make them fit his 5-step framework, so maybe you guys can help give your own idea of how it could fit down in the comments. I would really love to see you guys try to conform these things to what comes next. Anyway, Booker says the mysteries revolve around an outsider who comes into an event and has to discover the truth of what happens. He argues that because of this, the hero has no real investment and thus cannot grow over the course of a mystery. But this is evidently untrue based on the many mysteries where exactly this happens. I mean, Altered Carbon immediately springs to mind as a more modern example. The hero definitely grows by the end. Murder on the Orient Express also deals with a moral dilemma that forces the main character to grow by the end. And that's a classic example. Like I said, Booker's bias is on full display here. He's forced to admit to the existence of a plot beyond his 7 plots, but he's nothing but dismissive of mysteries to the extent that he really comes off uneducated on the matter. Anyone with even the smallest inclination towards reading could tell you that mysteries are a viable plot that has been time-honored and that can result in really satisfactory character growth. So again, I'm going to do a video on mysteries in the future. If you guys think that you can explain how mysteries fit Booker's 5-step structure, leave it in the comments. I would really love to see those discussions. The final plot, mentioned by Booker, again in a dismissive way that attempts to negate the plot's relevance, is the rebellion against the One. Booker describes this plot, though again, he doesn't even try to conform it to his 5-step structure, as when a hero must rise up against an all-consuming power, gaining strength in order to achieve this end, only to give up that strength in order to finally defeat the oppressive force. Probably the most famous and most overt example of this plot structure in recent memory would be the Matrix trilogy. They even refer to Neo as the One in that story. Neo, as the hero, must assume great power in order to throw off an oppressive force, but in the end, he finally overthrows that force by willingly giving up his power in order to truly free Zion. Just as with the mystery, I would really love to see you guys try to conform this to Booker's 5-step structure in the comments. That discussion would probably honestly be really, really interesting. I'm gonna do videos myself on comedies, tragedies, Rebellion Against the One, and mysteries. They are time-honored, viable plots that go way back, and honestly, Booker did not do them justice. You know, we'll get there in the future, guys. There's a lot of narrative stuff that we're going to talk about at some point. But alright, that is going to bring us to the close of this one today. It was a little bit longer, I know. If you're still here, it's much appreciated. Just let me caveat one more time before I go that this discussion has not been all-encompassing. I find discussion of the 7 plots useful because it gets you started when it comes to thinking about plot structure in general. But the truth is that there is so much more to writing than just 7 plots, even by Booker's own grudging admission. Even better, there are always going to be more plot structures as writers create and inspire new narratives. I hope that videos like these are helpful to you as a writer in that vein. What are some other plots outside of these 9 that you guys can think of? Some that weren't mentioned in this video. Let me know that in the comments. Those chats are always a thrill to me. Again, if you've listened this long, I am very grateful. Please go that final step. Like and subscribe. It truly does help the channel. Keep writing out there, guys. Take care of yourselves. And as always, may the Force break your chains.